The day I stood up to my bully boss and shocked the whole office. Long-time lurker here, but after what happened yesterday, I couldn't resist sharing this. I've been processing everything that went down, and honestly, it still feels like something out of a movie. You know when you daydream about standing up to a terrible boss, and it always feels like something you'll never actually do? Yeah, well, somehow, I did it, and it was one of the wildest moments of my life. Here's the full story of how I finally stood up to my nightmare boss, Greg, and shook up the whole office. Let me set the scene for you. I'm 29, working as a graphic designer at a mid-sized marketing firm. I've been with the company for about 4 years now, and for the most part, I really like my job, at least, before Greg showed up. 2 years ago, Greg was promoted to department head. From the moment he took over, the vibe of the entire office shifted, and not for the better. I went from enjoying my work to dreading every single day. Greg, now 42, is the textbook definition of a toxic boss. He's not a leader, he's a tyrant. He's the kind of guy who thrives on control, nitpicking the smallest details, and belittling people just to assert his dominance. It wasn't just me either. Everyone felt it. Greg had this way of turning everything into a power struggle, making people feel incompetent, and feeding off that discomfort. It was exhausting. For me, it was even worse. For some reason, Greg seemed to have a personal vendetta against me. Maybe it was because I'd been in the company before he arrived, and he saw me as some kind of threat, or maybe he just didn't like my face. I don't know. What I do know is that I was constantly in the line of fire. No matter what I did, it was never good enough. He was always the first to critique my work, pointing out issues that no one else saw and making sure to do it in front of the whole team. It was demoralizing. It wasn't just the work critiques, though. Greg had this habit of sending passive-aggressive emails late at night. I'd get them at 11 p.m. with vague questions like, "Are you sure this is your best work?" Or just a thought, "But shouldn't this be better by now?" He made it sound like I was slacking off, but I was killing myself trying to keep up with his ever-changing demands. I felt trapped in this cycle of never-ending, impossible expectations. To give you a better idea of just how bad it was, let me tell you about one specific incident that happened about 6 months ago. I had been working on a big project for a high-profile client, a complete rebranding that was one of the most complex jobs I'd ever done. I put my heart and soul into it, working overtime and weekends to get everything perfect. When I presented the first round of designs to the client, they loved it. I was so proud of the work I had done. Then came Greg. During our internal review, he absolutely ripped me apart. He hated everything. He went into this whole spiel about how my designs were uninspired, amateur, and not up to the company's standards. He didn't give any constructive feedback, just vague, snide remarks about how it wasn't professional enough. The worst part? He did it in front of the entire team. It felt like public humiliation, and the worst part was that there was no way to defend myself without coming off as defensive or petty. That night, I got the usual follow-up email from Greg at 11:30 p.m. In it, he didn't offer any specific changes or solutions. He just said, "Let's try harder next time." No suggestions, no feedback, just this thinly veiled insult implying that I hadn't been working hard enough. That email was the final blow to my morale on that project. I started doubting myself constantly. Was I really that bad at my job? Was I not seeing something that everyone else could see? The anxiety kept me up at night, and I found myself dreading every interaction with him. Over time, the tension between Greg and me only grew worse. He'd make sarcastic comments in meetings about how long I was taking on projects, even though I was juggling more than anyone else on the team. If anything went wrong, no matter how small, he'd immediately find a way to blame me for it. If a deadline was tight and we were scrambling to meet it, Greg would suddenly forget to approve key pieces of the project, delaying everything, and then he'd turn around and pin it on me for poor planning. I knew I wasn't alone. My coworkers were suffering too. Greg had a habit of micromanaging and criticizing everyone, especially the newer hires. One of my coworkers, Lucy, 25, had only been with the company for a year, and she was already looking for an exit because of Greg's behavior. He would find the tiniest mistakes in her work and then blow them out of proportion, as if one misaligned graphic in a draft was the end of the world. We all talked about it privately, whispering in the break room or venting over drinks after work, but no one felt they could do anything about it. And then yesterday happened. Yesterday started off like any other soul-crushing Monday. Greg had scheduled one of his infamous Monday morning kickoff meetings at 9 a.m. sharp, which, as usual, everyone dreaded. These meetings were supposed to be about setting goals for the week, but they always turned into a session where Greg would tear apart last week's work and make everyone feel like they were failing. I had been working on a big client project, another branding overhaul. This one was massive, and the client was incredibly important to the company. I had been busting my ass on this for weeks, trying to meet Greg's ridiculous and ever-changing expectations. The client, on the other hand, was thrilled with the direction. I had gotten multiple emails from them praising the designs, and I thought, maybe this time, Greg would finally approve it and give me some credit. Nope. The second I presented the new designs, Greg's face twisted into that all-too-familiar expression of disappointment mixed with smug superiority. He didn't even let me finish my presentation before launching into a tirade about how the work was subpar and not even close to ready. He made some vague remarks about how the design didn't reflect the brand's values, but he didn't explain what he meant. He just kept saying it wasn't good enough, without offering any direction or suggestions for improvement. Then, he went further, implying that my lack of progress was dragging down the team and that maybe I wasn't cut out for this level of work. It was one of the worst public humiliations I'd ever experienced. The team sat in stunned silence, no one daring to speak up. I could feel my face getting hot, and for a moment, I felt like I was going to cry right there in the middle of the meeting. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, and all I wanted was for the ground to swallow me whole. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of shrinking under Greg's criticism like I always had before, I felt this surge of anger. Something inside me snapped. I realized, in that moment, that I was done. I was done being Greg's punching bag, done letting him treat me like I was worthless, done sacrificing my mental health for a job that made me miserable. I knew I had to stand up for myself, even if it meant risking everything. Without thinking, I stood up from my chair. The room went completely silent. Greg stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in surprise as he realized what was happening. All eyes were on me, but for the first time, I didn't care about the audience. I had been pushed too far, and there was no going back. I called him out for how he had been treating me, and not just me, everyone. The constant belittling, the vague feedback, the toxic environment he had created, where no one felt safe to speak up. As I spoke, I could see Greg's expression harden. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of the entire team. But I kept going. I laid out every example of his bullying behavior, from the late-night passive-aggressive emails to his habit of undermining people in front of their peers. I pointed out how none of his criticism was ever constructive, how he just tore people down for the sake of making himself look better. I told him, point blank, that he was a bully, and I wasn't going to take it anymore. By the time I finished, the room was dead silent. No one moved. Greg was staring at me, red-faced and speechless, but I didn't care what he thought. I grabbed my bag, told him I was done, and walked out of the meeting. As I walked out of the office, my hands were still shaking, but I felt this immense sense of relief. I had finally said what I'd been holding in for years. I wasn't sure what the fallout would be, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt free. I took the rest of the day off. I didn't call in sick or ask for permission, I just left. When I got home, I started second-guessing myself. What had I just done? Would I get fired? Did I just throw away my job and burn all my bridges? Part of me was terrified, but another part of me felt strangely calm, like no matter what happened, at least I had stood up for myself. By midday, my phone started blowing up with messages from coworkers. Apparently, after I left, the entire office had been thrown into chaos. Greg tried to continue the meeting like nothing had happened, but it was clear that something had shifted. People were shaken. Some of my colleagues started pushing back on his criticisms during the rest of the day, questioning his authority in subtle ways they never had before. Greg, apparently rattled by the confrontation, wasn't his usual self. The tension was palpable. Later that afternoon, I received a message from Lucy, my coworker who had also been on the receiving end of Greg's harsh treatment. She told me that after I left, HR had been flooded with complaints from other employees. My outburst had opened the floodgates, and people were finally speaking out about Greg's behavior. For months, maybe even years, people had been suffering in silence, afraid to say anything. But now that someone had finally stood up to him, it gave them the courage to do the same. I decided to draft my own formal complaint to HR, detailing all of Greg's behavior and attaching copies of the late-night emails he'd sent me over the months. It was cathartic to lay it all out in black and white. I wasn't expecting much to come from it, but at least I felt like I was doing something. The next morning, I got a call from HR. They wanted to set up a meeting to discuss my complaint. I was nervous but also relieved that they were taking it seriously. When I got to the office, I noticed something strange. Greg wasn't there. Whispers were going around the office, and by the time I got to HR, it was confirmed Greg had been put on administrative leave. Apparently, my complaint, combined with the flood of others that had come in after my confrontation, had forced HR to take action. Over the next few days, more and more people came forward with their own stories of Greg's bullying. Some of them had been dealing with it even longer than I had. It was like a dam had broken, and all the resentment and frustration people had been holding back was finally pouring out. By the end of the week, it was official, Greg was gone. Now that the dust has settled, I'm still processing everything that happened. It's weird to think about how much power I had given Greg over my life for so long. I had let him make me feel small, incompetent, and trapped in my own job. But the truth is, the moment I stood up to him, everything changed. It wasn't just about calling him out, it was about reclaiming my own self-worth and realizing that I didn't have to accept being treated that way. I don't know what the future holds for me at this company, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe again. The atmosphere at work is so different now. Without Greg, people are actually collaborating, sharing ideas, and working together without the constant fear of being torn apart. It's still early days, but I think we're heading in the right direction. As for me, I learned something important. It's never too late to stand up for yourself. Even when you feel like you're powerless, even when the odds are stacked against you, you have a voice. And sometimes, all it takes is one person speaking up to start a ripple effect that can change everything.